Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Workplace Safety North webinar, Unlocking Workplace Wellbeing, Psychological Safety Essentials for Small Business. My name is Gabby Lemon, and I'm the event specialist here at Workplace Safety North. We appreciate your attendance here today, and we want to mention a few housekeeping items before we get started. Your microphones have been muted, and we ask that you use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen for speaker questions. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical issues using the Zoom application, do let us know in the chat box and we'll do our best to help you. Please note this webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording, a copy of the presentation, and resource information will be sent to you within a few business days. Today we are joined by Lisa Dupree and Lindsay Digby from Workplace Safety North. I'll invite Lisa and Lindsay on screen to start today's webinar. Welcome.
Thanks, Gabby.
Thanks, Gabby. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your time this morning. We're excited to provide you with some great resources for you as small businesses. And without further ado, I think we'll get started. So if we want to go to the next slide. We definitely want to just encourage you to know that this is a safe learning environment. There is no judgment here. We certainly hope, because we will be speaking about mental health and psychological safety, that we are providing you with that type of environment. So we're very conscientious of that. There is a helpline that is available to you at the number there is should you need to reach out to discuss anything from today's session with professional help. And then we also want to encourage you to flash us a thumbs up if you need to leave, or a thumbs down if there's something that's not right in terms of the information that we're providing, or you want to speak to that afterwards or ask any questions. So again, just to note that the views presented here are the views of Workplace Safety North and don't necessarily reflect those of the entire province of Ontario or any of the external authority bodies in the province. Next slide. So today, in this presentation, we want to provide you with a basic foundation about psychological safety. We know that as small businesses, we know that your employees are like your family. So today's discussion is just to help you think about ways in which you can make your workplace healthier and a safer place for everyone. So some of the discussion points that we're going to go through, we want to help you identify how psychological safety is connected to applicable laws and rules that may apply to your business. And then sometimes definitions can be confusing. So we're going to break down what psychological safety really means so that everyone is understanding these terms from the same viewpoint. We also want to take a look at how stress can affect how we feel at work. We want to learn about how it can impact us at work and why, as employers, it's important to pay attention to stress in the workplace. We're then going to look at what we call the RACE principle and racing towards psychological safety. And this is a special method that we use in health and safety to help improve psychosocial safety in the workplace. So we'll discuss what it means and how it can help you in your own workplaces. We next want to take a look at the hierarchy of controls, and it's a tool that we use in health and safety, and it's going to help us make our workplaces better and safer, and they use a step-by-step process through this hierarchy of controls. So we'll quickly take a look at that as a tool that we can provide you with as well. And then we also want to look at just beyond compliance and what you need to follow in terms of legislation. There are also a lot of best practices out there. So we want to share a few of those with you, as well as some tools to help you get started. We don't want to leave you hanging with all of these resources and not know where to start. So we will provide you with some great resources and tools to help you get started on this journey and or continue your journey if you've already started looking at psychological safety in your workplace. Next slide. Okay, so you do have legal responsibilities in the province. So we want to, before we bring up these different pieces of legislation, we want to put it out there to you. What pieces of legislation are you aware of that support these requirements to create a psychological safe workplace? So think about Ontario and Canadian laws and put them in the chat if you're aware of any pieces of legislation that speak to mental well-being or psychological safety in the workplace. And then we'll take a look at what you've put in the chat. I will bring up the chat. Does anybody have any ideas, or?
We'll give it a couple of seconds, Lisa, and if we don't see anything come in the chat, then we can kind of share what those legal responsibilities are. Oh, there we go. So one from Angel, Ontario Health and Safety Act. Wonderful. That is
absolutely. Why don't we bring up a few of them, Gabby, then, that we have on the screen? So some of the ones that you may want to consider that you may have requirements to meet obviously fall under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. They can also pertain to the Employment Standards Act, which is also managed by the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. We've got our WSIB Workers' Compensation or Workplace Safety and Insurance Act. There are also human rights legislation, duty to accommodate, as well as labor relations. And so there are others as well. You may have Personal Information and Privacy Act, so anything to do with privacy. There's accessibility for Ontarians with disabilities. So there are quite a few different pieces that are out there. You may have internally policies and procedures or collective agreements. So we're going to look at a couple of the more common ones in the next couple of slides and just go over what some of those legal requirements are as they pertain to those pieces specifically. Next slide, please. There you go. Okay. So there are three parts, if you will, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. We need to complete a violence assessment. So that's one of the first places that you can start. It is a legal requirement for workplaces to conduct a violence assessment. And there's three parts to these violence assessments. One is to take kind of stock of a general physical environment. So, you know, your general physical environment in the workplace and what are the potential hazards as they relate to violence. Then you need to look at what other risk factors might be in play, if you will. And then also take a note of assessments for any specific risks. So we're going to provide you with both that e-tool and the workbook so that you can complete your own violence assessment if you haven't already done so. So that's a great place to help you understand where some of the risk factors might be negatively influencing workers, their well-being, and contributing to mental harm in your workplace. So why is that important? It's important because the protection of physical safety is one of the 13 factors in the CSA standard, and we're going to talk to the CSA standard, but it actually is a factor when it comes to creating a psychologically safe workplace. So if employees know that you have assessed and are controlling the risk of workplace violence to a minimum based on what is within your control, that's going to increase their perception of being psychologically safe at work. Next slide. So another piece of legislation we want to take a look at in terms of what you're legally required to do or be aware of is under the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, the WSIA. So on January 1st of 2018, the WSIB added a chronic mental stress policy came into effect. This policy explains under which workplace situations the WSIB would allow entitlement to workers' compensation benefits for those workers who suffer from a chronic mental stress that arose out of and in the course of their employment. So that's what's the important piece, is that this claim and entitlement to these benefits would have to be determined by the WSIB as having arose out of and in the course of their employment. There are also two other policies as they relate to traumatic mental stress and as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. And you should be familiar with these policies, and they can be found on the WSIB website for more information. But let's take a little bit of a review of the other two policies next. So the post-traumatic stress disorder, or the presumption of that disorder, is that a specified professional diagnosis where certain workers are recognized as having a kind of a line of work where they're going to be exposed potentially to traumatic stress and thereby potentially suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. So those kind of workers might include paramedics, police, firefighters, nurses who provide direct patient care, Specific workers may be in correctional institutions, but there is a list of workers who may be covered under that PTSD presumption on the WSIB website. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about traumatic mental stress, as well as just mental stress in terms of what it is. So sometimes work can be stressful, and when that stress contributes to a mental stress injury, the worker may need more time to recover. So a work-related mental stress injury is a psychological injury or illness that's caused by one or more substantial sources. And the reason I bring this up is because this can create what we call a traumatic response to different work-related events. So that's the third WSIB policy that we looked at the previous slide regarding traumatic events. So people who have work-related mental stress injuries can be entitled to WSIB benefits and services, and they can be a result of a one-time traumatic event or multiple traumatic exposures or substantial work-related stressors, such as harassment. So this is any behavior that someone knows or can be reasonably expected to know that's not welcome, including sexual comments, advances, or persistent following or invasion of physical space, or harassment that includes physical violence or threats of physical violence, such as escalation of verbal abuse into a traumatic physical abuse. So you can see how something might start off as maybe not intentional, or recognizing that they should know better, that could be considered as harassment, and it can actually lead to a multiple exposure, if you will, and therefore a traumatic mental stress claim. Other types of stressors can include bullying. So that's a common form of harassment, such as intimidation, gossip, innuendo, social isolation, coercion. There can also be highly stressful just by the nature of someone's job. So if somebody has responsibilities that over matters involving life and death, or their routine work is in extremely dangerous circumstances, somebody who's in a job where they witness a fatality or a horrific accident. So there are a number of different workplace stressors that can contribute to this type of claim or mental stress traumatic events. Next slide, please. Sorry, there we go. Okay, what mental stress isn't? So there, under WSIB's policies, there are certain situations, if you will, or workplace actions or employer decisions that are not considered as mental stress under their policies. So we have a couple of them listed here on this slide. However, workers may be entitled to benefits for chronic mental stress due to an employer's decisions or actions that are not part of the employment function. For instance, workplace harassment or conduct that is a reasonable person would perceive as abusive. So you want to be mindful that there are going to be certain things you need to do as employers, certain actions within the workplace related to employment that won't be considered as mental stress, but you need to be very aware of what that line, if you will, is between carrying out your employment contracts and actions as a supervisor or an employer, and then potentially crossing the line where somebody might perceive something as being abusive. So examples of mental stress injuries that are not likely to be covered because they are just being followed as an employer's decision or action might be, as an example, a grocery clerk experiences anxiety after his employer changes his shift schedule, or a forklift driver has been seen numerous times violating company safety rules, so the employer actually suspends them without pay for these continued safety violations. Those would be considered employment actions or decisions and not necessarily mental stress contributors. Next slide, please. Another piece of legislation that we want to take a quick look at is the Employment Standards Act. So the ESA, under this act, as administered, as I mentioned, by the Ministry of Labor, Immigration and Training Skills Development, covers a whole multitude of workplace topics, including the ones on the screen here. So these legislative requirements are important in order to demonstrate to your employees that you're informed, you're aware of their rights, and that you can and will support them in their time of need. Some of these may not apply to your workplace, but it comes back to having a general understanding or an awareness so that we can educate and support our workforce with trust and transparency. And again, it comes back to keeping those communication lines open. Something we do want to point out in terms of new legislation under the ESA is that if you are a temp agency or a talent recruiter, there is a new licensing application system that came into force on July 1st, 2023. And on January 1st of 2024, licensing requirements will become mandatory. So if you want more information on the Employment Standards Act and all the various topics and pieces of everyday life in the workplace that they cover under that act, you can go to the Ministry of Labor's website and there'll be a link for the Employment Standards Act there. Next slide, please. Takes me a minute to get to the next slide because I've got notes at the bottom here. Okay, there we go. There we are. So the Ontario Human Rights Code is another piece that we want to take a look at. And under this code, they prohibit actions that discriminate against people based on a protected ground in a protected social area. So as they pertain to the workplace, what is a protected social area? That might include accommodation or housing that's provided by the employer, or contracts that include employment and other types of contracts, employment itself, goods, services, and facilities, and also it includes membership in unions or trade or professional associations. So when someone has experienced a mental stress injury and is receiving compensation, it is an opportunity for us to look at whether the workplace contributed to this and how we can make it safer for all employees and for those who are returning to work. So employers have a legal duty to accommodate the needs of people with disabilities who are adversely affected by a requirement, a rule, or a standard. So each person's needs, as we know, are unique, and we need to consider each one individually, each request individually. So accommodation is what might work for one is not necessarily going to work for the other. So recognizing these different grounds and needs to accommodate, it's important that we look at each individual case on a case-by-case basis, as all of us are unique and will have different accommodation needs. So we want to provide you with this information from a prevention perspective to ensure that your policies and your processes are lined up in order to ensure that you are protecting these prohibited grounds and that we treat each other, under these grounds as we need to and not contravene any of them inadvertently. So prohibited grounds, there is potential for harassment claims. So that's another good reason to make sure that your processes and your policies are lined up and are protecting these human rights under this code. Next slide, please. Now we want to look at some of those definitions we spoke to in the agenda. We want to make sure that everybody has the same kind of working knowledge or coming at this from the same viewpoint. So some of the more common definitions are the ones that we're going to go through right now. So when we think of a psychological health or psychological health and safety work environment, it's our ability to think, feel, behave, and perform effectively in the work environment, in our personal lives, and society at large. And the goal being obviously being effective. So that is the overall arching goal of all of the programs, all of the resources that we put in place when we look at creating a psychological health and safety work environment. Next slide, please. Psychological safety. As a business, you need to strive to take a proactive risk management approach to work-related mental health. Psychologically safe workplaces are those that promote workers' psychological well-being and actively work to prevent harm to workers' psychological health, keeping in mind that these must be within the influence and control of the employer. We know that running your own business can be hugely rewarding, but for many small business owners, having sole responsibility for the company's success or failure can also take a toll on your own mental well-being. So while it can be tempting to focus all your time and attention on your business, you also need to take care of yourself. And as an employing small business owner, you face a range of unique challenges that affect your own mental health and the mental health of your staff. So depending on the type of small business that you have, some of these challenges can include putting in long hours, working intensely to meet the demands of your business or getting your new business off the ground, undertaking business-related activities like responding to emails and calls after hours. Those blur the boundaries between work and home. It often comes with running a small business, we know. Feeling isolated and not always having someone to share business worries with or someone that understands the demands of you running your small business. managing cash flow, financial issues, chasing invoices, feeling concerned over where the next job's coming from, and having multiple hats, wearing multiple hats, and performing multiple roles, managing demands of administrative and government regulations, such as the ones that we're introducing you to, and feeling responsible for yourself and to others, including your employees, obviously, and their families, as it all comes down to keeping and ensuring that your business is successful, but they are a lot of different stressors on small business. So we want to make sure that you're also looking out for your own mental well-being. Next slide, please. So psychological health and safety, as a business, we again encourage you to take a proactive risk management approach. And a psychologically safe workplace is one that promotes that workers' psychological well-being to prevent that harm from your workers when it comes, as it pertains to their psychological health. So we're going to now look at some of the more common psychosocial hazards that we find in the workplace. Next slide. Psychosocial hazards can be anything like interactions between and among workers in the work environment. Perhaps it's the job content. Maybe it's the way that the organization is organized or set up. Sometimes it's just might be organizational conditions and the workers, your own worker capacity, their needs, culture. There could be personal or other job considerations that need to be considered that will affect the level of risk or different risk factors as they pertain to psychosocial hazards in the workplace. There's also perceptions and experiences that people go through or have gone through that will influence both their health, their work performance, and job satisfaction. So there's a lot of different factors that we need to look at when we look at identifying what are the potential psychosocial hazards in our workplace. Sometimes it can also be just the way, as I mentioned, the way the work is organized, that can also have a negative impact on mental health or a physical injury or illness. When psychosocial hazards are not managed effectively, these can have a negative impact on your overall business, including your productivity, absenteeism, and turnover. And just in terms of providing you with a statistic, about 70% of Canadian employees are concerned about the psychological health and safety in their workplace at this time, and 14% don't think that theirs is healthy or safe at all. So we definitely want to take a look at how we can contribute to recognizing the hazards, assessing those level of risks, and then putting controls in place, which we will speak to next. If you want more information on statistics, and kind of breaking down some of those numbers I provided, they can be found under the Mental Health Commission of Canada, under the tab Workplace Mental Health. So they've got some great resources and statistics if you're wanting more on that. So let's look at what is the potential outcome of mental stress in Ontario through the eyes of WSIB and mental stress claims. In 2022, and these are allowed claims only, there were 832 PTSD claims, over 1,600 traumatic mental stress claims that were allowed, and 96 chronic. And in 2023, obviously we're not done the year yet, but the numbers are definitely trending towards the same as what they would be in 2022. So when we look at these statistics, as well as the financial cost, which is only one aspect of the impact. We also need to look at what is the impact on the rest of your team. So if you've got somebody who's off on one of these claims, things like increased workload, additional stress and demands can add up if they're not managed or controlled appropriately. So we have additional hazards in the workplace that can also cause additional harm to other workers when somebody is even off on one of these mental stress claims. So again, these are all things that we want to think of when we're trying to decide why it's important to start creating more psychological health and safety in the workplace. When we can be proactive and identify those hazards that are present in our workplace, then we can proactively mitigate them and reduce that potential for harm. And we want to always continue to support individuals who have experienced mental stress and are receiving benefits, but we also need to look at the systemic issues that are within our businesses to understand how we can evolve our practices and ensure that our work isn't hurting our people. Next slide, please. So next we're going to hand things over to my colleague Lindsay, who's going to go through this race principle that I quickly spoke to and how we can kind of help you identify and manage and control those hazards in your workplace. Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so thanks for joining, everyone. And in health and safety, our goal is really to protect our workers against all hazards in the workplace. Some are a little bit easier to control than others, and we can also recognize that some will be a little bit more physical and visible in nature than others. There are 6 hazard categories that we need to consider as we recognize, assess, and address how to best eliminate or reduce those likelihoods of someone being injured or getting sick in your workplace. One of these important categories is the psychosocial or psychological hazards. And that's essentially what we're talking about today. So this piece of the pie has always existed. However, it's really evolving, and we're starting to understand a little bit more about these psychosocial hazards, and they can be part of every single category that you see on your screen because there's always a human element to it. So we're going to take a look at the next slide here. And we're going to introduce you to the Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace CSA standard. Each one of the 13 factors that you see on the screen here, when they're lacking or absent from your workplace, it can actually cause mental harm to employees to the varying degrees. So much like safety hazards that can cause us physical harm, recognizing these psychosocial hazards will help us create more psychologically safe workplaces and, in turn, positive health and safety cultures. Once we recognize, we can assess our level of understanding of the risk, build our understanding of the actions that we need to take to eliminate or control or improve the risk and the hazard identified with the goal of prevention. We encourage you to download a copy of the standard from the CSA website. It is free and one of the only ones that's free, and provides you with some great information and guidance. As with the goal of any health and safety management system, so your program, it's about understanding the hazards, assessing them, controlling them, and determining how to evaluate for continuous improvement. Again, the standard is really designed in a way where the risk comes from these things being missing or absent in the workplace. So next, we're going to watch a quick video, again, just to highlight the CSA standard here. So let's see how this works.
Every day, millions of Canadians go to work. But every week, about 500,000 Canadians cannot because of a mental health problem or illness. And since most of us spend around 60% of our waking hours at work, ensuring our workplaces are psychologically safe is important business. But when it comes to health and safety in the workplace, we sometimes only think about physical health. Mental health, well, it's just not top of mind. But here's why it should be. The cost of mental health problems and illnesses to the Canadian economy is at least $51 billion per year. Employers can see the impact through things like absenteeism, lost productivity, and high turnover. It's a hefty price to pay. The workplace should provide an opportunity to feel productive and thrive. When we're not well, it affects everything we do, at home and at work. While people don't come with a maintenance manual, there is a process organizations can and should follow to prevent harm and promote overall mental wellness. It's called the National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace, and it's the first of its kind in the world. Developed in Canada and used by countless organizations and companies, it's the roadmap for employers to create a mentally healthier workplace. The standard is all about shifting workplace culture to value mental health and safety as much as we do physical health and safety. It provides a framework to assess your current workplace, set objectives, and take action to enhance the programs, policies, benefits, and training you already have in place at work. The standard is voluntary, and there's no single prescribed way to implement it. It's designed to allow for flexibility and customization to effectively implement in your unique organization. But sometimes that leaves employers wondering how to get started. The Mental Health Commission and its partners have created resources to help. Start by downloading the standard and looking at what policies and procedures you already have in place. The Assembling the Pieces Guide and Toolkit will take you step by step through implementing the standard. You could also take advantage of training resources like Being a Mindful Employee, a free online program that introduces employees to the factors that impact mental health and what we can all do to support our coworkers and ourselves. People are your most valuable assets. Commit to creating a psychologically safe work environment and help your employees thrive inside and outside the workplace. You can do this. Start today. Visit mentalhealthcommission.ca.
Awesome. So there is that resource. There are additional resources to support, looking at the standard. But I want to talk about now, what are some ways that we currently recognize and assess any hazard in our workplace? So I want this to be a bit of an engagement activity. So for those on the call or those attending this webinar, please use the chat feature and jot down some ways that we currently recognize things that can cause us harm, not in terms of mental health right now, just what do you use right now to recognize hazards? I'll give it a couple of seconds here. Let's see what shows up in the chat. Yeah, Emma, thank you. Risk assessments. That's great. Risk assessments are a great tool. What else do we do on a regular basis? Yeah, inspections, job safety analysis, exactly. So if we add some of them on the slide here, Gabby, so we can start looking for things that can cause psychological harm to workers, ultimately using the same tools that we currently leverage, however, with a slightly different lens. We've introduced you to the CSA standard, and by leveraging those tools we're already using and expanding our knowledge regarding psychosocial safety, you can start looking at the workplace, again, a little differently, knowing about these particular psychosocial risk factors. It really does come down to evolving our thought process when it comes to managing traditional health and safety, because employees want to know that they will not be harmed physically or psychologically as a result of the workplace contract that's in place. So I'm going to show you a couple of different tools now where you can integrate into your regular practice. You can leverage them, integrate them into your existing recognition tools like workplace inspections, your risk assessment, culture assessments, incident investigation. But assessments can sometimes leave us feeling like we're running in so many different directions. But one of the best tools out there for assessing, your workplace mental health is the ability to have a conversation with workers about where work might be causing them mental harm. Workers should feel comfortable reporting these types of hazards like any other hazards, and a worker check-in is a great way to do that. So an example is what we have on the screen here, and it demonstrates some primary questions to ask, including what barriers they might be facing in their job. So what do you find most difficult about what you're doing? Did you learn anything? Do you still need help navigating it? Some of these are some questions that you can have during a one-on-one worker check-in that might help you understand how work may be causing harm. This is a WSN assessment tool that's designed to help managers understand the workplace, the work environment, the interactions that are occurring, and whether actions need to be taken by leaders or if further controls need to be put in place within the control of the employer. So you're going to be receiving a template of this type of tool in the follow-up email after the session. So I'd encourage you to check it out and maybe start integrating it as part of your regular check-ins with your employees to start to understand where work may be causing mental harm to your workforce. So on the next screen here, I want to just give us an example of when one of those 13 risk factors is absent or missing in the workplace. This can be the result of what happens. So if the negative contributing factor is we have unmanageable workloads, or if there's workplace conflict, we can start to see the negative impact here. It's employee burnout, withdrawal avoidance, lack of independence control, and we feel undervalued. And then that overall outcome is decreased performance and productivity, lower morale, absenteeism, high turnover rate, and negative workplace culture. Whereas if we have these pieces in place, the positive contributing factors here, we have manageable workloads, positive culture, we have clear expectations. So this is all back to leveraging those 13 factors in the standard. As a result, it can have a very positive impact. So deadlines are accomplished, we're proud of work and the workplace that we're working at. We understand those expectations, and then the overall outcome is higher performance, productivity, great morale, fewer absent days, higher employee retention, and ultimately a more positive workplace culture. So again, to tackle this, we can do it in a number of different ways, and I'm sure all of those who are on the call today have heard of the hierarchy of controls, and that's what we're going to be looking at next. Typically, what we see is a hierarchy for health and safety controls, but I'm introducing you to a new hierarchy, and it's called the hierarchy for psychological health and safety, and it relies on positive workplace culture. It's important to recognize that everyone needs to start with controls that are easier to implement, which is why we encourage and educate. And these are at the bottom of the hierarchy pyramid because they're foundational to the success of building a positive workplace culture. Everyone can encourage each other and everyone can become a little bit more educated. In the middle of this hierarchy, when we're talking about controls in the workplace, we're looking at redesign. So policies and procedures, training, other engineering and admin controls. These programs may already exist and can be redesigned to incorporate psychosocial or mental health and well-being standards and expectations. But before putting those controls in place, we do definitely need to look at the factors or risks from a company standpoint that might be placing our workers at risk of psychosocial hazards. This might include the company culture, so what's considered acceptable behavior, education and training opportunities around respect and civility, essentially everything that is tolerated or encouraged. We're going to want to look at how are we promoting, accepting, tolerating this. And then we look at specific job factors and demands that might expose a worker to a hazard. So, for example, working with the public. So if there's physical violence and harassment, you may also include psychosocial hazards as a category in your joint health and safety monthly inspection checklists. You can also provide committee members or health and safety representatives on training on what to look out for. Some other controls that may fall into the hierarchy here include adding psychosocial risks and hazards into your safe work plans and procedures and ensuring this is communicated and folks are trained. So progress is going to be made over time, but you're guaranteed not to make any progress if you don't even try at all. It just takes small steps. So the next tool and resource that we're going to look at, it's going to be slightly different depending on what kind of hazard you're trying to manage, but controlling and reducing the risk of violence, because this is something that we need to look at. It's rooted in legislation. Is the risk of violence taking place, and it has some very specific control options. As you can see on the slide here, it's highlighting, security systems, summoning immediate assistance as controls that would fall somewhere along the redesign area of the hierarchy, where training for respectful workplace or emergency response would fall under that educate level of the hierarchy. When you're trying to implement controls at your workplace, it's a very dynamic exercise that will shift, evolve, change based on the circumstances, and it will evolve or change depending on the individual as well. So we are going to be providing you with some additional resources, as Lisa mentioned earlier on, to assist you with this violence assessment that is ultimately rooted in legislation. So there will be something in a follow-up email to support you there. So on the next slide, I mentioned some of these already, but these are, again, some more examples of various controls that can be implemented. We also have things like education around stigma in the workplace, how we assign work, how we reassign or reprioritize when someone feels overwhelmed. We have things like accommodation of injury or illness, and also the right to disconnect policies that should be implemented as forms of controls to reduce the risk to mental harm. It's one thing to have them, but it's also another to implement them, follow them, and enforce them. So we will have a mental health, a small business guide available coming shortly, as well with some additional resources on how we can start to have these conversations at our workplaces with resources to support. Now, I want to show you some proactive versus reactive controls in your workplace. And again, you might be already doing some of these. You might not have heard of some of them, but on the next slide, we're going to focus on the proactive prevention strategies where harm doesn't even really have the opportunity to come into the environment, or it's caught early on and we can adjust proactively. So that template I showed you earlier about the one-on-one coaching check-ins, again, this is a really great proactive tool. We can have flexible work arrangements, respectful workplace policies, peer support groups. We can understand our workplaces a little bit deeper by doing culture assessments or audits. We can do organizational surveys. Again, the perception of workers is generally the reality. And so if we start to understand what they're experiencing and what they're feeling, we can implement proper controls to support worker well-being. Have controls around change management. Change is hard, but there's nothing constant except for change. And so if we do this well, we can prevent harm to our workers in a proactive sense versus having to deal with the repercussions reactively. And then, of course, we want to start looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion. And sometimes we do have to have those reactive controls. You know, we've got short-term disability benefits, modified work arrangements if someone does happen to go off on leave, for example, or are impacted by stress, as Lisa was mentioning earlier, supported by the WSIB. We also can sometimes have incidents that take place and can negatively impact individuals in ways that we don't even know can impact us sometimes. And so sometimes those controls have to be implemented as a result of an incident. But we also want to update our emergency response plans to be supportive of those situations as well. Now, one of the other controls that I always like to talk about is the language that we use. In the workplace, it can have a huge impact, either positive or negative, on an employee's experience. Think about the kind of language that we use currently, that we promote, that we reinforce in our workplace. Do you empower your employees to bring forward concerns regarding the way your language is potentially impacting their well-being or contributing to stigma? Recognizing those psychosocial hazards can also be a self-reflection activity on how you can carelessly contribute or carefully contribute to creating a psychologically safe environment. And again, our words can have a significant impact on how people interact within our business. So we recognize that as business owners, you're already well versed in how to best treat your customers. This is only a reminder that our language can be stigmatizing to others experiencing mental health challenges. Everyday language, sometimes not even being aware of our words, can cause harm to others. And when we know better, then we can do better. So examples on the screen here are very common terms you may hear in and about your circle of friends, your circle of workplace circle. Using language like this, I am so OCD, the weather is so bipolar, it can contribute to stigma and actually cause mental harm to the workers. And those who feel stigmatized are less likely to reach out for help and support. So although we may not be able to control others' language or how other people are speaking, we certainly can control what comes out of our mouth. And again, when we know better, then we can act a little bit more carefully towards preventing harm to others in the form of stigmatizing language. All right, so another great tool, and if you've participated in any of our previous webinars, you've heard us talk about this mental health continuum. It's a fantastic tool. When you're busy with your business, you may not notice the signs or changes in your own behaviors, thoughts, or feelings that may indicate you're struggling with your mental health. Sometimes the first person to notice that you're not yourself might be a family member, a friend, or a business partner. It's important to be aware of some of the common signs and indicators that can let you know that you might be struggling with your mental health. and even your coworkers as well. Some early warning signs are finding it difficult to concentrate on tasks, feeling tired or fatigued, being unusually tearful or emotional, getting angry or easily frustrated with tasks or people, drinking alcohol or using substances to cope, finding it hard to make decisions, and avoiding social situations. When we get stuck in a particular zone, whether that's healthy, reacting, injured, or ill, more focusing on the reacting, injured, or ill, we need to change our course of action. That change can be anything from self-care strategies, reaching out for support like your EAP, or a trusted colleague, a friend, or a family member, to reaching out to a professional organization. And remember, it's okay not to be okay. We just can't stay there. So this continuum is a great tool to leverage at your business. You can integrate some of these pieces into one-on-one check-ins like you would have seen earlier, incident investigation. Again, it's just an opportunity for you to start leveraging how we can start to recognize when work may be causing harm to the workers. Now I've got some questions for reflection here, and this is really just to get you thinking about, you know, what controls do you currently have in place for psychosocial hazards? What does your safety culture look like? Have you ever done a survey before? And do you truly understand that perception of the workplace? Because there are lots of tools available out there for you to start to get to know your workplace a little more intimately. And then how do we encourage our staff to seek assistance? So do we have an EAP program? Do we know what local resources are and that exist around us? Do we know them? Do we have them on hand? Do we use them as a proactive or a reactive mechanism? So again, it's just questions to get you thinking about, you know, what do we currently promote and have in place to support our workers? And I want to share also with you some additional tools. So we do have coming soon our Psychological Safety for Small Business, a practical guide from Workplace Safety North. That will be available very shortly. We will be supporting you with some additional tools in the follow-up email as well, like the Workplace Violence Assessment tool from the Occupational Health and Safety Council of Ontario to meet those legal obligations. Every workplace in Ontario has to have a violence assessment done of their workplaces. The free download, the CSA standard for psychological safety, is from the CSA. The mental health continuum will be a PDF version that we're going to provide you with in the email as well. And then you can always check out our website for additional resources, videos, webinars on our website. And I believe, Lisa, there was one more from the...
Yeah, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. I heard them on CBC yesterday talking about mental health resources that they've also posted to their website. So that's the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, if you're interested in some additional. And these ones are specific for small business.
Yeah, so we'll also be sending that link in the follow-up email as well. So this is really, you know, your call to action. What are you going to be focusing on? It's your call to action to do something differently moving forward, to create and foster a more psychologically safe work environment. So thank you very much for participating in the session today. That hour flew by.
Yes.
Lisa, maybe I'll hand it over to you just to finish off the program here.
Absolutely. So following today's webinar, as Lindsay and Gabby have mentioned, we will be sending you a link to all of those resources within a few days. We'll also be sending you an electronic course feedback survey. So you'll have 5 days to complete it. We really encourage you to complete it as soon as you get it, while this information is still fresh in your mind. We really appreciate your honest feedback. It's the only way for us to continuously improve our own programming moving forward. We definitely want to make sure that we're making a difference in the world of health and safety. So we do appreciate your feedback from today's session. And we also invite you to look at our additional resources at www.workplacesafetynorth.ca. We have different courses and products available for you in the realm of mental health. So please take a look and see if any of them might fit the needs of your business.
Great. Thank you to Lindsay and Lisa for joining us this morning. We do have a little bit of time for some audience questions. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A. I have received a couple, so I'll start with those. Someone asked, we have an employee assistant program and promote that with our employees. We're not sure how much we can ask our employees about their mental health without crossing any privacy laws. Can you advise?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to take that one, Lindsay?
Yeah, sure. You can add anything you want to that. Yeah, so it's a balancing act, right? We want to make sure that as an employer, we open the door. Because if our employees are experiencing challenges, whether it be at home, we want to be able to support them at the workplace and letting them know that their EAP or EFAP is available for them. That's a great start, but we also want them to be proactive in letting us know that if there are things at work that are also contributing or causing harm, we have an obligation. We need to know about that so we can put the right controls in place to be able to support and foster an environment that's not going to compound that harm. So I'm not sure, Lisa.
Yeah, no, I will. I'll add to that. It's a great start because again, it's about keeping those communication lines open. But I think it really goes to show from a proactive standpoint to make sure that you have the necessary policies and procedures in place. The more formal, and I know as small businesses, that's sometimes a challenge and a task, but the more that you've got things in writing that are communicated and trained with everybody, it's consistent. The messaging is consistent, whether it's a progressive discipline, whether it's a fit for work policy. Again, I think it just provides that consistent basis and then build upon that and have those discussions and look at work design, look at other workplace factors that might be causing stress. Some of them you may have to explain are just part of running a business and that those are employment decisions or actions versus what can I do within my control as a business owner or manager to make the contract or your employment as easy for you as possible. So it's again having flexibility, but at least having that dialogue and having those formal processes and policies in place as much as possible. And we're certainly here to help you with any of that. So please reach out if you need any assistance in that regard.
Great, thanks. We have another question here asking, where is a good place to start with all of these resources when it comes to knowing how our employees feel about psychological safety in our workplace?
I would definitely recommend the CSA standard. I think it providing you with all of those different areas of your workplace where you may be missing some policies or procedures, or you may want to take a look at factors or risks, if you will, or hazards within some of those categories. And I think as many of you have already pointed out in the chat, you've started by putting out a survey, asking your employees questions, and providing them with a way to sometimes maybe provide you that feedback anonymously. That might be another way of getting to the truth, if you will, and really identifying what some of those risks or hazards might be that are present in your workplace right now. So that would be a good starting point, I think. Anything to add, Lindsay?
No, there's a lot of resources and there's a lot more out on the big wide web. And so as an organization, you really should focus on the things that will make a positive impact for your workforce. And so if you are gathering feedback and doing surveys with your workers, they're going to tell you what will positively influence their experience at your work environment. So I would start there. There's always the encourage and educate. We can always learn a little bit more about, sometimes taking a training course or attending a webinar like this might just open up new windows that we never saw through before, seeing different perspectives. So the encourage and educate, the two pieces on the bottom of the hierarchy of controls are also a really great place to start as well.
I see someone is asking if we can put the slide of the psychological hazards up. Slide 19.
So Daniela, you will be getting a copy of the presentation if you were looking for that. And slide 19.
If you just wanted to take a picture.
This one here. Not sure if that's the one.
I did put it on screen, and we will be sending out a PDF of the presentation as well as the recording. So you'll have access to all the resources very soon.
And one note on this race principle and recognizing all the various hazards from these 6 categories in your workplace, I will toot the horn of WSIB and their health and safety excellence program. So for small businesses, it's a great program for you to engage in, where you can work on different foundational topics, including recognition of hazards and performing risk assessments if you don't already, or looking at specific controls. This excellence program that the WSIB launched in 2019 is a great opportunity for you to start working on some of those foundational pieces of your health and safety program and incorporating the psychosocial hazards into your policies, your programs and procedures. So again, I invite you to take a look at that on the WSIB's website if you're interested.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lisa. So not seeing any further questions, I'll ask if either of you have any final thoughts you want to share before we wrap up today.
I'll just share, you've got to start somewhere, take baby steps, right? Occupational health and safety can be, seem like a daunting task. It can seem overwhelming. We're not looking to reinvent the wheel with psychological health and safety. We're going to kind of struggle through this together. So just know that it's a journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so just start doing something a little bit differently tomorrow than you did today. And I think you'll see the positive impacts at your organization over time.
And I'll finish off by saying thank you to you as small businesses. You keep our province running, and for always doing the great work that you do and putting in the long hours that you do. So we really want to make sure that you've got the resources to help support your business and continue your business growing and keeping everybody safe and healthy in your workplaces. So thank you to our small businesses and to the employers and owners who are on today's session. Thanks very much for attending.
Thank you both, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar.